Your son loved you. He suffered for you. He died trying to earn your approval. Mr. McGregor, you are a disgrace to the uniform you wear. So hear me clearly. I sentence you to death, and I do it with a clear conscience.
On the evening of July 8, 2010, the small town of Harrington, Texas, gathered for its annual summer cookout at the local community park. It was one of those perfect Texas summer nights where the sun had finally begun its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that seemed almost unreal in their beauty. The temperature had dropped from the brutal heat of the afternoon to something almost bearable, hovering around 92 degrees, and a slight breeze carried the smell of mesquite smoke and barbecuing meat across the sprawling green space of the park. Families had set up at picnic tables scattered throughout the grounds, some with checkered tablecloths held down by rocks, others with blue tarps that fluttered gently in the evening breeze. Children ran between the tables, their laughter ringing out across the park like bells, chasing each other in games of tag that would last until the sun completely disappeared and parents finally called them in, exhausted and happy. The community pool had been closed for the evening, but the splash pad was still running for the smaller children, creating a miniature oasis of water and sound in the corner of the park. Grills lined the perimeter of the main gathering area, and the men of Harrington, fathers, grandfathers, uncles, stood around them with beers in their hands, discussing everything from the local high school football team's prospects for the upcoming season to the drought conditions that had been plaguing Texas for the past 2 years. Their wives circulated among the tables, trading recipes and gossip, sharing updates on children and grandchildren, the kind of social bonding that happens in small towns where everyone knows everyone else's business anyway and may as well make it official. The town of Harrington itself was the kind of place where time seemed to move differently than in the rest of the world. It was a town of about 8,000 people, located in central Texas, far enough from any major city that it maintained its own identity and culture. The main streets still had locally owned businesses, a hardware store, a diner, a bank, a post office, that had occupied the same buildings for decades. People knew their neighbors. Children played in the streets without parents constantly watching. Doors were left unlocked. It was the kind of place that appeared in movies about small-town America, the kind of place where community events like the summer cookout were genuinely important, genuinely anticipated. The annual summer cookout had been a tradition in Harrington for more than 30 years, started by the Parks and Recreation Department as a way to bring the community together during the long hot months when most people were either at home trying to stay cool or out of town visiting family. It had grown into something much larger than anyone had anticipated, becoming a fixture on every family's calendar, a night that was marked in advance, that people planned their vacations around, that was understood to be non-negotiable. This particular year, 2010, had been especially hot. The summer had arrived early and with vengeance, temperatures reaching the low hundreds by mid-June. The drought that had been threatening Texas for several years had finally arrived in full force, and the grass in the park was brown and crispy underfoot. But tonight, despite the heat, the park was full. At least 400 people, maybe more, had shown up for the cookout. It was a good turnout, better than some years. But one person was noticeably missing, and his absence would come to matter more than anyone at that gathering could possibly have imagined. 12-year-old Chase McGregor had never missed the summer cookout. Not once in his entire life. From the time he was a baby, brought to the park by his parents wrapped in blankets and sunscreen, through his toddler years when he'd splashed in the splash pad with his diaper on, through his elementary school years when he'd run with the other kids in games that seemed to have no rules but everyone understood anyway, Chase McGregor had been at the summer cookout. It was part of who he was in the community. Chase was the quiet kid with the big smile who always helped the younger children, who never got into fights, who was always polite to adults. He was the kind of kid that teachers liked to have in their classes. He was the kind of kid that other parents pointed to as an example of how to raise a child properly. But Chase wasn't there this year. His absence didn't go completely unnoticed at first. There were hundreds of people at the park, and it was easy to assume that any particular person was simply on the other side of the grounds, somewhere out of view. But as the evening progressed, as the sun dipped lower and the shadows grew longer, as people began to organize the main event, the pie-eating contest for the children, which was always held around 8 o'clock, the absence of one quiet, polite 12-year-old boy began to be remarked upon. Around 8:30 in the evening, as the sky was transitioning from the deep orange of sunset to the purple blue of twilight, Chase's best friend Mason was sitting with one of the parents, a woman named Sarah Henderson, whose daughter was in Mason's class at school, and the conversation had naturally drifted to the topic of why various children who had been expected weren't at the park. Sarah was remarking on the fact that she hadn't seen Chase yet when Mason, with the casual matter-of-factness that only a 12-year-old boy can manage, said something that would change everything. Chase said earlier that he didn't think he would make it to the park tonight, Mason said, swinging his legs against the picnic bench he was sitting on. He said it was because of training. Those 8 words, because of training, struck Sarah Henderson in a way that she couldn't quite explain at the moment. She would later describe it as a chill running down her spine, a sense that something about those words didn't sit right with her. Training. What kind of training would make a 12-year-old boy unable to attend the community summer cookout? If you're watching this right now and you have children or grandchildren, I want you to listen carefully to what you're about to hear. This is a story that will challenge you, that will make you angry, that will force you to think about the line between discipline and abuse, between toughness and cruelty. If you're not already subscribed to this channel, I'm asking you to subscribe right now. Subscribe because we tell the stories that need to be told, the stories that help us understand how tragedy happens, the stories that help us protect the people we love. And please, in the comments below, I want you to tell me, do you believe that discipline and toughness are the same thing? Tell me about your own experiences with strict parenting. Tell me what you think the line should be between pushing a child to be strong and pushing them to the point of harm. This community didn't know the answer to those questions until it was too late, and their story might help us answer them before tragedy strikes in our own communities. Sarah Henderson's instincts told her that something was wrong with the picture that Mason had just painted. She didn't have children of her own, but she had spent enough time around kids to know that they didn't usually plan their evening around training at 8 o'clock at night. She didn't have a logical reason to be concerned. Maybe Chase had a soccer practice or he was training for some kind of sport she didn't know about, but something in her gut told her to pay attention to what Mason had said. She found Deputy Sheriff Tom Caldwell, who was working security at the event that night, and she mentioned to him what Mason had said. She described it almost apologetically, as if she was bothering him over nothing, but she said that it seemed odd to her that Chase McGregor would miss the community event because he had training scheduled for this particular evening. Deputy Caldwell, who had been a law enforcement officer for 18 years and who had developed a strong instinct for when something wasn't right, took her comment seriously. He thanked her for mentioning it and said he'd look into it. Deputy Caldwell made a mental note of the name and the vague concern, and then he continued with his duties at the park. But the seeds of suspicion had been planted. Something about the way the boy's best friend had mentioned training in such a matter-of-fact way, something about the fact that Chase had apparently told Mason that he wouldn't be at the event because of this training, it didn't sit right with the deputy. He'd been a cop long enough to know that 9 times out of 10, when a parent scheduled activities that would keep their child from a community event on a specific evening, there was usually a good reason for it. But sometimes, just sometimes, there was a reason that deserved closer investigation. About an hour later, Deputy Caldwell was still at the park, and the evening was winding down. The sun had fully set now, and the park was lit by strung lights and the glow of charcoal in the grills. People were packing up, loading leftover food into containers, gathering their children to head home. It was around 9:30 when Deputy Caldwell decided that he needed to follow up on what Sarah Henderson had told him. He radioed his partner, Deputy James Martinez, and told him that he was going to swing by the McGregor residence to do a welfare check on the boy. He didn't tell anyone what he was checking on, didn't make a big deal out of it. Just said he wanted to make sure everything was okay at the McGregor house. The drive from the community park to the McGregor residence took about 10 minutes. The McGregor house was located on the outskirts of town, on a property that sat on about an acre of land, surrounded by other properties with similar acreage, so there were no immediate neighbors close enough to be considered truly adjacent. The house itself was a single-story ranch-style home that had been built in the 1980s, painted a cream color with dark brown trim. There was a wraparound porch, a 2-car garage, and a long driveway that was visible from the road. The property had a certain isolation to it, far enough from the main part of town that it wasn't immediately obvious if something was going on there, but not so far as to be considered rural or isolated in the extreme. When Deputy Caldwell pulled up to the house at approximately 9:45 in the evening, he immediately noticed several things that registered as slightly unusual. The truck in the driveway, a dark red Chevy pickup that he knew belonged to David McGregor, was parked there. The lights in the house were on, visible through the windows of the front room. But there was something about the scene that felt off to him. He couldn't quite put his finger on what it was, but his instincts, honed by 18 years of police work, were telling him to proceed carefully. Deputy Caldwell walked up to the front door and knocked. It took a moment for anyone to answer, but then the door swung open and David McGregor appeared in the doorway. Deputy Caldwell would later describe what he saw in a report filed with the Harrington County Sheriff's Department. Resident appeared to be in a state of distress. Subject was sweating profusely despite the temperature being in the low 90s. Subject's breathing appeared elevated, as if he had recently engaged in physical exertion. Subject's hands appeared to be trembling slightly. When asked about the whereabouts of his son, Chase, subject did not immediately respond, and his eyes appeared to shift or look away from the officer's gaze. David McGregor was a man of medium height, approximately 5 feet 10 inches, with a build that suggested he spent a significant amount of time exercising. His hair was dark and kept very short in the style of a military cut, and his face had the weathered appearance of someone who spent a lot of time outdoors. He was wearing athletic shorts and a t-shirt that was soaked through with sweat. His hands, which Deputy Caldwell noticed were trembling, also bore fresh marks. A scraped knuckle on his right hand, what appeared to be a rash or abrasion across the back of both hands, dirt under the fingernails. "Can I help you, Deputy?" David McGregor asked, his voice carrying a slight edge that suggested he wasn't particularly happy to see a law enforcement officer at his door. "I'm just doing a welfare check," Deputy Caldwell said, keeping his voice neutral and professional. "Someone mentioned that your son Chase might not be at the community cookout tonight because he had training scheduled. I just wanted to make sure everything was okay." David McGregor's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. It was the kind of micro-expression that a trained observer might catch. A tension in the muscles of the face that betrays an emotional response that the person is trying to hide. "Everything's fine," he said. "Chase is he's inside. He's resting. We had a training session this afternoon and he's pretty tired." "I'd like to see him," Deputy Caldwell said. It wasn't a request, but it also wasn't phrased as a command. It was stated in the kind of neutral tone that law enforcement officers are trained to use when they're not quite sure if they have legal grounds to push further but they want to keep their options open. "He's sleeping," David McGregor said. "I don't want to wake him up." "It will just take a minute," Deputy Caldwell said. He was beginning to feel the warning bells going off in his head. The scratches on McGregor's hands, the sweat, the trembling, the elevated breathing, the way his eyes had shifted when asked about Chase, all of it added up to something that wasn't quite right. Deputy Caldwell had been doing this job long enough to know that sometimes these small signs were nothing, just coincidences, explanations that were perfectly innocent. But other times, these small signs were the first indication of something much more serious. "I'd prefer if you didn't," David McGregor said, and now there was a definite edge to his voice, something that could be interpreted as either protectiveness over a sleeping child or something more sinister. "My son needs his rest." "I understand," Deputy Caldwell said. "But I'm going to need to confirm that Chase is okay. If you don't want to wake him, I can just look through a window or have you bring him to the door." David McGregor's hands clenched into fists at his sides. It was subtle, but it was there. "I think you should leave," he said. "I'm afraid I can't do that," Deputy Caldwell said. His training had kicked in, and he'd shifted into the mode that law enforcement officers use when they suspect that a situation might be escalating. He'd moved his hand to his belt, not to his weapon, but to the radio clip there, and he'd subtly shifted his weight so that he could move quickly if he needed to. "I need to verify that Chase is safe and well. If you're unwilling to cooperate, I'm going to have to escalate this to a full welfare investigation." It was at that moment that Deputy Martinez pulled up in his vehicle behind Deputy Caldwell's cruiser. Martinez got out of the car and walked up to join his partner, and the visual presence of two uniformed law enforcement officers seemed to deflate some of the resistance that David McGregor had been mounting. "Fine," David McGregor said, his voice tight. "Come inside but be quiet. I don't want him woken up." David McGregor turned and walked back into the house, and the two deputies followed him inside. They found themselves in a living room that was neat and orderly, with furniture that looked relatively new and well-maintained. There was a large television mounted on one wall, a couch, some easy chairs, and on one bookshelf, a collection of military memorabilia, framed photographs of David McGregor in uniform, medals and commendations, a photograph of him with what appeared to be his military unit. "He's in his room," David McGregor said, gesturing toward the hallway. "Down there, first door on the left." The deputies walked down the hallway, and the first thing they noticed was that the hallway was lined with more military imagery, photographs of David McGregor at various stages of his military career, a framed poster of a motivational saying about discipline and strength, a photograph of a group of soldiers in combat gear. Everything about this hallway suggested that military life was central to David McGregor's identity, that it was the lens through which he viewed the world. When they reached the first door on the left and opened it, they found what appeared to be a typical 12-year-old boy's bedroom. There was a bed, a dresser, a desk with a computer, posters on the walls, one of a video game character, one of a movie superhero, one of a soccer player. But the bed was empty. There was no sign of Chase McGregor. The deputies exchanged a look, and Deputy Caldwell immediately turned and walked back to the living room where David McGregor was still standing. "Where's your son?" he asked, his voice no longer neutral but carrying an undertone of urgency. He's around here somewhere," David McGregor said, and now the trembling in his hands was more pronounced. "Maybe he's in the bathroom." "I don't think so," Deputy Caldwell said. He walked to the back door of the house and looked out the window into the backyard. What he saw in the glow of the porch light would later be described in numerous reports and testimony as the moment when it became clear that something tragic had occurred. In the backyard, illuminated by the exterior lights of the house, there was an elaborate obstacle course. There were old tires laid out in a line, apparently meant to be jumped through. There were cinder blocks stacked in various formations. There were ropes hanging from the branches of a large oak tree. There were metal buckets and weighted packs scattered around. It looked like a military training course, the kind of obstacle course that might be used by military personnel or competitive athletes training for extreme sports competitions. It looked deliberately designed, purposefully constructed. And in the middle of the obstacle course, barely visible in the shadows but unmistakably there, was a small figure. A boy. A body. Deputy Caldwell immediately exited the house through the back door, Deputy Martinez close behind him. As they approached the body, it became clear that what they were looking at was a 12-year-old boy who was not moving. His skin had taken on the pale, slightly bluish color that indicated a lack of oxygen, a lack of circulation. His body was positioned awkwardly, as if he had collapsed and then simply stayed where he fell. His clothing was soaked through with sweat. There were marks on his arms and legs, abrasions, bruises, areas of skin that appeared to have been scraped raw. Deputy Caldwell immediately called for an ambulance and checked for any signs of life. There were none. Chase McGregor was not breathing. He had no pulse. His body was still warm, which suggested that death had occurred relatively recently, perhaps within the past hour or two. Deputy Martinez, meanwhile, was securing the scene and calling for backup. Within minutes, the quiet residential neighborhood had transformed into an active crime scene. More deputies arrived. A homicide detective was called. The ambulance arrived and the paramedics confirmed what the deputies already knew. Chase McGregor was dead. David McGregor was immediately taken into custody for questioning. As he was being led away, he made several statements that would later be used as evidence against him. He said that Chase had just collapsed, that he didn't know what had happened, that Chase had been training and then suddenly went down. He said that he had called 911, which he hadn't, and that he had been trying to revive his son when the deputies arrived. He said that Chase had been weak, that Chase couldn't handle the physical demands that David had been placing on him. An autopsy was performed on Chase McGregor that night by the medical examiner for Harrington County. The initial findings were shocking. Chase's body showed signs of extreme physical exertion. His muscles contained elevated levels of lactic acid, indicating that they had been pushed to their absolute limits. His lungs showed signs of fluid accumulation, consistent with heat exhaustion and dehydration. His heart showed signs of strain. The preliminary conclusion was that Chase McGregor had died from a combination of heat exhaustion, dehydration, and cardiac failure brought on by extreme physical exertion in conditions, both environmental and imposed, that his young body simply could not withstand. When toxicology results came back, they showed that Chase's body had contained no drugs or alcohol. There were no signs of poisoning. There were no underlying medical conditions that would have made him susceptible to sudden cardiac failure. Chase McGregor had been a healthy, normal 12-year-old boy who had died because he had been forced to engage in a level of physical training that his body could not handle, in heat that would have challenged even an adult in good physical condition, without adequate hydration or rest, under the direction of his own father. The community of Harrington reacted with shock and horror. A boy they had known all their lives, a boy who had been at every community event, a boy who was known for his kindness and his gentleness, a boy who had never gotten into trouble, was dead. And he was dead because his own father had trained him to death. Tell me in the comments right now, have you ever experienced pressure to be tougher than you are? Have you ever had someone tell you to stop being so sensitive, to man up, to handle things without complaining? What did that do to you? This case is going to explore exactly those questions, and I want to hear your stories because they matter. What emerged in the days following Chase's death was a picture of a boy who had been systematically subjected to rigorous military-style training by his father for the better part of his childhood. Investigators interviewed neighbors, teachers, coaches, and family members. They reviewed school records. They spoke with Chase's few close friends. And what they found was disturbing and heartbreaking in equal measure. Chase McGregor had been a gifted student academically. His grades were consistently in the A to B range, and multiple teachers noted that he was intelligent, thoughtful, and engaged in class. He was quiet. Some of his teachers described him as shy, but he participated when called upon, and his written work showed creativity and depth of thought. Chase had a particular talent for art. His visual arts teacher, a woman named Margaret Chin, described him as one of the most gifted young artists I've taught in my 10 years here. His portfolio contained sketches and paintings that showed a maturity and sophistication beyond his years. Many of his works featured superhero characters, but not in the conventional way. Chase's superheroes were often shown in moments of vulnerability, of doubt, of struggle. One painting in particular showed Superman sitting alone on a rooftop, his head in his hands, and the art teacher had made a note that Chase seems to understand that strength isn't about never struggling, but about what you do when you struggle. Socially, Chase was not a typical 12-year-old boy. He didn't participate in the aggressive sports that many of the boys in his grade played. He wasn't interested in football or basketball or wrestling. Instead, he had joined the art club, the chess club, and the drama club. He had performed in the spring musical at school, playing a supporting role in the school's production of The Music Man. He had a close group of friends, maybe 5 or 6, that he spent time with, and his friendships were characterized by kindness and loyalty. His best friend Mason described him as the nicest person I know. Like he wouldn't hurt anyone. He was just good. But at home, everything was different. David McGregor had served in the United States Marine Corps for 18 years. He had joined the military right out of high school and had built his entire identity around that service. He had been a drill instructor, had participated in various combat deployments, and by the time he retired from active duty at the age of 36, he had been shaped by the military in fundamental ways. He believed in discipline. He believed in pushing through pain. He believed in the kind of toughness that comes from pushing yourself beyond what you think you can do. These values had served him well in the military, and he believed that they should serve his son well too. The problem was that his son was not a Marine Corps recruit. His son was a sensitive, artistic, introverted 12-year-old boy who had inherited his mother's temperament and talents rather than his father's aggressive, physically oriented nature. And David McGregor could not accept that. Chase's mother, Catherine McGregor, had died 5 years earlier when Chase was 7 years old. She had suffered from cancer, and despite aggressive treatment, the disease had taken her life. She had been the buffer between David and Chase, the one who had allowed Chase to pursue his interests in art and academics without constant criticism or pressure. She had balanced David's severity with her own gentleness. When she died, that balance was lost. In the 5 years since Catherine's death, David had become increasingly focused on molding Chase into what David believed a boy should be. To David, the ideal boy was tough, physically strong, self-disciplined, and emotionally controlled. A boy who didn't complain. A boy who didn't cry. A boy who could handle pain and hardship without showing weakness. A boy who was being prepared for a world that David believed was dangerous and unforgiving, and in which only the strong survived. Chase was not that boy, and David seemed determined to make him become that boy no matter what it took. According to interviews with neighbors, the training had been escalating for years. What had started as mandatory daily runs and physical exercise had evolved into elaborate training routines modeled after military training. David had constructed the obstacle course in the backyard sometime in the 2 years before Chase's death. He had built it systematically, adding elements as he thought of them. He had designed it specifically to push Chase to his limits. The training sessions were typically held in the evenings, after Chase came home from school. They would start with warm-ups, push-ups, sit-ups, running in place, and then would progress to more demanding activities like the obstacle course. Chase would have to run through the tires, jump over cinder blocks, pull himself over barriers, carry weighted packs, hold uncomfortable positions for extended periods. If Chase complained, David would respond with criticism. "You're being weak. Men don't quit. You're embarrassing yourself. I'm trying to make you stronger and you're acting like a child." Chase had learned that complaining was met with additional punishment. Sometimes additional physical training, sometimes verbal humiliation, sometimes being forced to stand at attention while David lectured him about discipline and toughness. A neighbor who lived about 300 yards away and could occasionally hear the sounds coming from the McGregor backyard described hearing Chase crying and David yelling things like, "Keep going," and "Don't you dare quit." The neighbor had mentioned it to his wife once or twice, had expressed concern that the training seemed too intense, but had ultimately rationalized it as a parent being strict with his kid and hadn't interfered. Another neighbor, a woman named Ruth Henderson who lived on the other side of the McGregor property, had spoken to David once about the intensity of the training. She had mentioned in a friendly, conversational way that the training session seemed very demanding for a boy Chase's age. David had responded with irritation, saying that his son needed to learn discipline and that the neighbor shouldn't concern herself with how he raised his own child. After that, Ruth had backed off, not wanting to cause trouble. Teachers at Chase's school had noticed signs of physical strain. Chase would sometimes come to school limping, and when asked about it, he would simply say he was training with his dad. He had bruises that he would explain away as coming from the obstacle course training. He would sometimes fall asleep in class, and when asked about it, he would apologize and say he'd had training the night before and hadn't slept well. One teacher, a man named Robert Hammond who taught Chase's 7th grade physical education class, had become concerned enough to speak to Chase privately. He had asked Chase if everything was okay at home, if the training he kept mentioning was something he wanted to be doing. Chase had looked uncomfortable and had said that his dad was training him to be stronger, that he needed to be stronger, that his dad said he was too soft. Robert Hammond had considered reporting his concerns to the school counselor or the school's administration, but he had hesitated. He didn't want to overstep. He didn't want to accuse David McGregor of anything inappropriate. Chase wasn't coming to school with obviously severe injuries. Chase wasn't acting like a child who was being beaten or abused. The training, while intense, could theoretically be something that Chase had agreed to participate in, something that was part of a legitimate fitness regimen. In retrospect, after Chase's death, Hammond would testify that he regretted not reporting his concerns. He would say that he had allowed his desire not to interfere to override his instincts that something was wrong. He would say that if he had reported his concerns, if he had forced the issue, maybe Chase would still be alive. That guilt would stay with him for the rest of his life. The investigation into Chase's death revealed that David McGregor had been carefully documenting the training sessions. On his computer, investigators found video files and photographs that David had taken of Chase undergoing various training activities. In some of the videos, Chase could be heard crying and begging his father to let him stop. "I can't do this, Dad," Chase's voice could be heard saying in one video. "Please, I'm tired. Please let me stop." And David's response was always the same: "Keep going. You're almost done. Men don't quit." One particularly disturbing video, taken approximately 3 weeks before Chase's death, showed Chase completing a challenging set of exercises, running, jumping, carrying heavy packs, in what appeared to be intentionally hot weather, during the middle of the day. The video lasted nearly 2 hours. At various points throughout the video, Chase could be seen struggling, slowing down, nearly collapsing. Each time, David's voice could be heard pushing him to continue. "Come on, Chase, you're better than this. Stop being weak. Your mother would be ashamed if she could see how soft you've become." The mention of Chase's mother in this context was particularly disturbing. David had apparently been using Catherine's death as motivation for the training, framing it as something that would have made her proud, or conversely, suggesting that Chase's mother, who was remembered by everyone who knew her as a kind, gentle, nurturing person, would be disappointed in how weak and soft Chase was becoming without her influence to counteract David's training. In the hours and days following Chase's death, as investigators pieced together the physical evidence and the circumstantial evidence and the testimony from people who knew the family, a clear picture emerged. Chase McGregor had not died from a single act of abuse. He had died as a result of years of systematic, deliberate, escalating physical and emotional abuse. He had died because his father had become obsessed with the idea of making his son into a version of himself, and when Chase refused to or couldn't become that version, David had intensified his efforts. Chase had died the victim of a man who had confused toughness with love, who had believed that breaking his son's spirit would somehow make his son stronger. The evidence also suggested that on the evening of July 8, 2010, the night of the summer cookout, David had deliberately kept Chase home to conduct an especially intense training session. Multiple witnesses would later testify that this training session had been particularly harsh. One neighbor who happened to be outside her house that evening reported hearing unusual amounts of yelling and sounds of distress coming from the McGregor backyard. She heard David's voice raised in anger, heard what sounded like Chase crying or in pain, heard sounds consistent with physical exertion in an extreme state. The training session had apparently gone on for several hours. The medical examiner's report suggested that Chase had pushed himself to the point of complete physical and cardiovascular failure. His body simply shut down. His heart, already stressed from years of intense physical training coupled with the emotional strain of trying to live up to his father's impossible expectations, simply stopped. Chase McGregor had died, according to the medical examiner, from acute heat stroke, severe dehydration, and cardiac arrhythmia brought on by extreme physical exertion. He had died in his backyard, on an obstacle course that his own father had built, having been driven to this point of physical failure by the one person in the world who was supposed to protect him. In the days following Chase's death, the town of Harrington struggled to process what had happened. The community that had seemed so safe, so stable, so whole, was forced to confront the fact that tragedy could strike anywhere, could be perpetrated by anyone. David McGregor was no longer the decorated ex-military officer who had served his country. He was the man who had killed his own son. The question that hung over the town in the immediate aftermath was simple but profound. How had this happened? How had a community allowed a father to subject a child to what amounted to torture? How had neighbors, teachers, coaches, friends, people who saw Chase regularly, people who had the opportunity to intervene, allowed this to continue for years? The answer, painful as it was that they had rationalized it. They had told themselves that it wasn't their place to interfere. They had accepted David's framing of what he was doing as training and discipline, rather than what it actually was, abuse. They had been unwilling to confront the possibility that something terrible was happening because confronting it would have been uncomfortable and messy. But Chase McGregor was dead and their discomfort was irrelevant now. The criminal investigation moved forward quickly. The evidence was overwhelming. The autopsy was clear. The videos were damning. The testimony from neighbors and teachers painted a picture of years of escalating abuse. David McGregor was arrested and charged with murder. The case went to trial 9 months later, in April 2011, in the Harrington County Courthouse. The courthouse was a beautiful old building made of limestone, constructed in 1924, that had presided over the legal proceedings of Harrington County for nearly 90 years. It had seen murders and divorces, disputes and reconciliations, the full range of human conflict and resolution. But nothing quite prepared it for the trial of David McGregor. The prosecutor assigned to the case was a woman named Sarah Williams. Williams was a career prosecutor who had worked in the Harrington County District Attorney's Office for 14 years. She had handled numerous murder cases, but she had never encountered a case quite like this one. The murder of a child by a parent was always tragic, always difficult, but this case had an additional layer of complexity. This was not a case of a parent acting in a moment of rage or desperation. This was a case of a parent deliberately, systematically, intentionally subjecting a child to conditions that would ultimately result in that child's death. The defense attorney assigned to David McGregor was a man named James Peterson. Peterson was a public defender, assigned to the case through the public defender's office. He was not happy with the case. No defense attorney would be, but he had a job to do, and that job was to provide David McGregor with the best legal defense possible within the bounds of the law. Peterson was competent and experienced, but he was also realist. The evidence against his client was overwhelming, and the nature of the crime was such that it would be difficult to generate sympathy for David, no matter how skilled the defense might be. The trial lasted 2 weeks. The courtroom was packed every day with members of the community, members of Chase's extended family, media representatives, and interested observers. The local news stations covered the trial daily. National media outlets sent reporters to cover what was being characterized as a tragedy of spectacular proportions: the death of a child at the hands of his own father, and the question of whether that death was the result of a father's misguided efforts to toughen his son or whether it was, in fact, murder. The prosecution's case was presented first. Sarah Williams called witnesses to establish the timeline of Chase's death, to present the medical evidence, to introduce the videos and photographs that David had taken, to present testimony from people who knew the family and could speak to the nature and intensity of the training that Chase had been subjected to. The medical examiner testified about the autopsy findings. He explained in clinical terms what had happened to Chase's body: the heat stroke, the dehydration, the way Chase's organs had begun to fail under the stress of extreme physical exertion in extreme heat. He explained that Chase had essentially been pushed to death, that his cardiovascular system had been unable to handle the demands being placed upon it, and it had simply given out. Neighbors testified about the sounds of Chase crying and David yelling. The neighbor who had heard the training session on the evening of Chase's death testified that the intensity of what was happening seemed extraordinary, even compared to previous sessions. It sounded like he was really suffering, this neighbor said, her voice breaking as she spoke. I heard him crying, heard his father yelling at him, heard sounds like something was seriously wrong. I keep thinking that I should have called someone, that I should have done something, and maybe if I had, he'd still be alive. Teachers testified about Chase coming to school exhausted, bruised, limping. They talked about his academic performance, which had been suffering in the months before his death, likely due to his physical and emotional state. They talked about the artistic talent they had observed in Chase, about how his work seemed to reflect an emotional depth and an awareness of struggle that seemed unusual in a 12-year-old. Videos of the training sessions were played in court. The courtroom was silent as Chase's voice, young, strained, desperate, could be heard begging his father to let him stop, and hearing his father's stern, unyielding responses. Some observers in the courtroom wept as they watched. Some had to leave the courtroom because they couldn't bear to watch. The videos were devastating because they put a voice and an emotional reality to what had been, up to that point, an abstract tragedy. Chase McGregor was no longer just a victim of a crime. He was a real child, struggling, suffering, dying. The prosecution also presented evidence of David's mindset and his intentions. They presented the elaborate obstacle course he had built, showing that this was not a random act but a deliberate construction designed specifically to push Chase to his limits. They presented evidence of David's military background and his stated beliefs about discipline and toughness. They presented testimony from people who knew David, who could speak to his obsession with making Chase into a tough, strong son, and his contempt for what he perceived as Chase's weakness. One witness, a man who had served with David in the Marine Corps and had remained friends with him, testified that David had often complained to him about Chase being too soft, too sensitive, not tough enough. This witness said that David had repeatedly expressed his frustration with what he saw as Chase's lack of toughness, and had talked about his plans to use intensive training to toughen Chase up. He said Chase needed to learn what it meant to push through pain, the witness testified. He said that all the coddling and artistic interests and emotional sensitivity was going to make Chase weak, and that it was his job as a father to fix that before it was too late. The prosecution presented a picture of David McGregor as a man driven by ideology, the ideology of toughness, of discipline, of the superiority of physical strength and emotional control over sensitivity and introspection. A man who had become so obsessed with imposing this ideology on his son that he had been willing to ignore all signs that his son was suffering, that his son was struggling to keep up with the demands being placed upon him, that his son was dying. The prosecution's final witness was Chase's best friend, Mason. Mason, now 13 years old and clearly traumatized by the loss of his friend, testified about his last conversation with Chase on the day he died. He told me he didn't think he'd make it to the park, Mason said, his voice small and young in the courtroom. He said his dad was making him train extra hard and he was really tired. He seemed scared. I've never seen Chase scared before, but he was scared that day. Mason paused and then added, I should have told someone. If I'd known he was really in danger, I would have told someone. The defense presented its case next, and James Peterson did his best with what he had to work with, which wasn't much. He could not deny the basic facts of the case. Chase was dead, and he had died as a result of physical exertion imposed by his father. The challenge for the defense was to argue that this was not murder, that David had not intended to kill his son, and that therefore a charge of murder was inappropriate. Peterson called character witnesses who testified to David's background, his military service, his love for his son. He presented testimony from people who said they had never witnessed anything that would suggest David was being intentionally abusive, that the training seemed to be something that David genuinely believed was good for Chase. He presented testimony from a psychologist who argued that David's behavior, while misguided, was not the result of a murderous intent but rather the result of a father who had lost perspective on what was appropriate for a child, who had become obsessed with a particular ideology about toughness and discipline, but who had not deliberately set out to kill his son. Your Honor, Peterson said in his closing argument, my client is not a murderer. My client is a father who made terrible, tragic mistakes in judgment. My client believed he was helping his son. He believed he was toughening him up, making him stronger, preparing him for a difficult world. Those beliefs were misguided. His methods were inappropriate. His expectations were unreasonable. But none of that makes him a murderer. The evidence does not suggest that David McGregor woke up on the morning of July 8 with the intention of killing his son. The evidence suggests that David McGregor made a series of choices, wrong choices, terrible choices, that ultimately resulted in his son's death. But that is not murder. That is negligence, recklessness perhaps, but not murder with the deliberate intent to kill. The jury, however, did not agree. After deliberating for 14 hours over the course of 2 days, the jury returned with a guilty verdict on the charge of second-degree murder. They had found that the evidence supported the conclusion that David McGregor had deliberately subjected his son to conditions that he knew or should have known would cause serious bodily injury or death, and that this behavior constituted murder. Actually, I need to correct that. The jury found David McGregor guilty of first-degree murder. The distinction is important, because first-degree murder carries the possibility of a death sentence in Texas, whereas second-degree murder does not. The jury had concluded that David's actions were premeditated, that he had deliberately planned and executed a course of conduct that resulted in Chase's death, and that therefore the most serious murder charge was appropriate. The guilty verdict was met with a mixture of emotions in the courtroom. Some people wept. Some people nodded as if they had expected this outcome and were relieved that justice was being served. The victim's extended family, Chase's aunts and uncles and cousins, sat in the front row of the courtroom, and some of them put their heads in their hands, as if the weight of what had happened was suddenly too much to bear. The sentencing phase of the trial came 3 days after the guilty verdict. This was the phase in which the jury would decide what punishment David McGregor would receive for his crime. In Texas, for a first-degree murder conviction, the jury could sentence him to anywhere from a minimum of 5 years in prison to a maximum of life imprisonment, or they could recommend the death penalty. The prosecution presented arguments for why the death penalty was appropriate. Sarah Williams presented evidence of the cruelty of David's actions, the deliberate nature of his conduct, the vulnerability of the victim, a child who was dependent upon his father for care and protection, and the aggravating circumstances of the crime. She talked about Chase's suffering, about the years of abuse that had led up to the final event that resulted in Chase's death. She talked about the breach of trust that David had committed, about the fact that he was supposed to be Chase's protector and instead had become his killer. Chase McGregor was a child, Williams said in her closing argument during the sentencing phase. He was a child who loved his father, who wanted to please his father, who tried desperately to be the person his father wanted him to be. And his father, the one person who was supposed to love him unconditionally, the one person who was supposed to protect him, used that love and that trust as a weapon. He systematically, deliberately, intentionally subjected his son to conditions that he knew would cause him extreme suffering. And when his son finally broke, when his son's body finally gave out under the strain of these conditions, his father did not call for help immediately. His father let his son lie there. And when the police arrived, his father lied about what had happened. If that is not worthy of the death penalty, I don't know what is. The defense, in its closing argument during sentencing, pleaded for mercy. Peterson talked about David's background, about his struggle to come to terms with his wife's death, about his misguided but not malicious attempts to prepare his son for a difficult world. He argued that a life sentence would be an appropriate punishment, that executing David would not bring Chase back, and that imposing the death penalty would only increase the tragedy by removing a living human being from the world. I'm not asking you to excuse what David did, Peterson said. I'm not asking you to minimize the tragedy that occurred. But I am asking you to consider that there is a difference between a man who deliberately set out to kill his son and a man whose misguided beliefs and poor judgment resulted in his son's death. That difference matters. That difference is the difference between a man who deserves to die and a man who deserves to spend the rest of his life in prison, reflecting on what he has done, living with the knowledge of what his actions have caused. The jury deliberated for 2 days. On the evening of the second day, they returned with their decision. They had voted to recommend the death penalty for David McGregor. The judge, whose name was Robert Sanderson, had the authority to either accept the jury's recommendation or to reject it and impose a different sentence. But Judge Sanderson, after reviewing all of the evidence in the case, after hearing the testimony, after considering the aggravating and mitigating circumstances, decided to accept the jury's recommendation and to sentence David McGregor to death. When Judge Sanderson announced the death sentence, he took the unusual step of addressing David directly, rather than simply reading the sentence from the bench. Judge Sanderson, a man who had been a judge for 23 years and who prided himself on maintaining judicial composure in all circumstances, appeared visibly moved by the case. His voice, when he spoke, was steady but carried an emotional weight that was rarely heard in a courtroom. "Mr. McGregor," Judge Sanderson said, looking directly at David McGregor, who was standing at the defense table with his attorney. "You have been found guilty of murder in the first degree. You have been sentenced to death by lethal injection. But before I formally pronounce the sentence, I want to say something to you, something for the record, something that I believe needs to be said. You're a disgrace. You are a disgrace to the uniform you wore. You are a disgrace to the military, to the values of discipline and honor that you claim to embody. You are a disgrace to the concept of fatherhood. You had one job, one sacred duty as a parent, and that was to protect your child, to nurture your child, to help your child become the best version of himself that he could be. Instead, you set out to remake your child in your own image, and when he resisted, when his nature did not fit your expectations, you forced him, pushed him, drilled him, until you had drilled the spirit out of a child who only wanted your love and approval. Chase McGregor was a remarkable young man. By all accounts, he was kind, talented, intelligent, creative, and capable of bringing joy and beauty into the world. He had his own gifts, his own talents, his own path in life. But you couldn't accept that. You couldn't accept that your son might be different from you. And so you set about destroying those gifts, crushing that creativity, breaking that spirit, all in the name of making him tough, making him strong, making him into a version of yourself. And you succeeded. You broke him. You broke him so thoroughly that you killed him. And do you know the worst part? Do you know what truly makes you a disgrace? The worst part is that your son loved you. Your son wanted to please you. Your son was willing to suffer, willing to push himself to his limits and beyond, all because he wanted your approval, wanted you to be proud of him, wanted you to love him. And you took that love and you weaponized it. You used it as a tool to push him harder, to demand more, to drill him into the ground. You have no right to be alive. You have no right to draw breath, no right to exist in this world, having destroyed a child who had his whole life ahead of him. The world is worse off for your existence. Chase's family is destroyed. Chase's friends are traumatized. The community is reeling from what you did. And why? Why, Mr. McGregor? Because you couldn't accept that your son might be a different kind of person than you are? I am sentencing you to death, and I do so with a clear conscience and a firm belief that this is justice. You will be taken from this courtroom and imprisoned until your execution. And perhaps, in the time remaining to you in this world, you will finally come to understand what you have done. You will finally understand the magnitude of your crime, the extent of your betrayal, the depth of your cruelty. And perhaps you will spend every remaining moment of your existence wishing that you could undo what you have done, wishing that you could go back and be the father to Chase that he deserved. But you can't undo it. You can't go back. Chase is dead. And that is your doing. Judge Sanderson paused, seeming to gather himself, to reassert the judicial composure that he had momentarily allowed to slip. It is therefore the judgment of this court that you, David McGregor, having been found guilty of murder in the first degree, are hereby sentenced to death by lethal injection. This sentence shall be carried out in accordance with the laws of the state of Texas. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down and the proceedings were concluded. David McGregor was led away by court officers, and the courtroom erupted in a chaos of emotion. Some people weeping, some people embracing, some people simply sitting in stunned silence. The death sentence for David McGregor became national news. The case of the ex-military officer who had drilled his son to death captured the attention of the American public in a way that few criminal cases do. It was covered by every major news outlet. It was the subject of numerous think pieces and opinion articles. It was discussed in coffee shops and living rooms and offices across the country. It raised fundamental questions about parenting, about discipline, about the line between toughness and cruelty, about how much authority a parent should have over a child's body and mind. In the years that followed the trial, David McGregor's case became a cautionary tale. It was cited in parenting discussions as an example of what happens when discipline goes too far. It was discussed in law enforcement training programs as an example of signs of abuse that neighbors and teachers should recognize and report. It was used in schools to educate students about the warning signs of child abuse and how to report it. Chase's extended family, particularly his aunts and uncles who had been close to him, turned their grief into advocacy. They worked with child protection organizations. They spoke publicly about Chase's case. They tried to ensure that Chase would be remembered not as a victim, not as a tragedy, but as a young person whose life had meaning and whose death could potentially prevent other tragedies. Chase's art was preserved and displayed in galleries and community spaces. His drawings and paintings, images of superheroes struggling and suffering, of young people trying to find their way in a complex world, of beauty existing alongside pain, were used to illustrate the complexity of human experience, and particularly the experience of young people navigating growing up. In 2013, approximately 3 years after Chase's death, a foundation was established in his name, the Chase McGregor Foundation for the Support of Creative Youth. The foundation provided scholarships to young artists, supported after-school arts programs in schools, and worked to ensure that young people who were interested in creative pursuits, art, music, drama, writing, would have the opportunity to explore those interests without facing judgment or pressure to conform to narrow definitions of toughness or strength. The foundation also worked to educate parents and educators about the dangers of imposing rigid expectations on children, about the importance of allowing children to develop their own interests and talents, about the fact that strength and toughness come in many forms and are not limited to physical prowess or aggressive, domineering behavior. But even with all of this advocacy, even with the foundation established in his name, even with his art being displayed and celebrated, Chase was still dead. The fact that his death might prevent future tragedies was no consolation to the people who loved him. His parents? Well, his father was in prison on death row and his mother was already gone, but his extended family, his friends, his community, they would all miss him forever. The question that hung over the case in its aftermath was the same question that had been raised at the time of the trial. Had justice been served? Had the death sentence been the appropriate punishment for David McGregor's crime? The answer to that question was complicated and depended largely on one's perspective on capital punishment. Those who believed that the most severe punishment should be imposed for the most severe crimes generally supported the death sentence for David McGregor. Those who opposed capital punishment generally opposed the death sentence even for this case, despite its extreme nature. But what was universal, what everyone agreed upon, was that Chase McGregor's death was a tragedy that should never have happened, and that the circumstances surrounding it raised serious questions about how communities protect their children, about how people recognize signs of abuse, and about where the line should be drawn between discipline and cruelty. Tell me in the comments right now, do you think the death sentence was appropriate for David McGregor? Do you think he deserved to die for what he did? Or do you think a life sentence would have been more appropriate? What would have prevented this tragedy? What could have been done differently? I want to hear your thoughts because they matter. This community didn't know how to respond to what David was doing to Chase, and their uncertainty allowed a tragedy to occur. We need to learn from that. We need to understand how to recognize abuse. We need to understand where the line is between discipline and harm. Your perspective matters and I want to hear it. The legal appeals process for David McGregor stretched on for years after his conviction and death sentence. The appeals process in capital cases in Texas is deliberately lengthy and complex, designed to ensure that every aspect of the trial is reviewed, that every possible error is identified and considered, that the defendant has every opportunity to challenge the conviction and the sentence. David McGregor's appeal was handled by a team of lawyers, both from his public defender's office and from organizations that specialize in death penalty cases. These lawyers argued various points on appeal: that the trial judge had made errors, that certain evidence should not have been admitted, that certain evidence should have been admitted but wasn't, that the jury had been improperly instructed, that new evidence had come to light that should be considered. The appeals process resulted in some changes to the case. A state appellate court found that one piece of evidence, one of the videos recorded by David, should not have been admitted because it had been obtained in violation of David's Fourth Amendment rights regarding search and seizure. However, the appellate court concluded that even without this particular video, the other evidence against David was so overwhelming that the error was harmless and did not require reversal of the conviction. Over the course of the appeals process, which lasted approximately 14 years from the time of David's conviction, additional information came to light about David's background and his mental state at various points in his life. A psychiatric evaluation, conducted as part of the appeal process, found evidence of a possible personality disorder or narcissistic personality traits that might have contributed to David's obsessive focus on toughness and his inability to accept Chase as being different from himself. However, this information did not alter the fundamental facts of the case or the nature of David's crime. Meanwhile, David McGregor himself had spent those 14 years on death row in the Texas Department of Criminal Justice death row facility, located at the Polunsky Unit in Huntsville, Texas. Death row inmates in Texas are held in solitary confinement for 23 hours a day, with only 1 hour for exercise or recreation. They are not allowed to participate in prison jobs or educational programs. They are essentially warehoused, waiting for their death sentences to be carried out. David McGregor, by all accounts from prison officials and guards, had been a model prisoner. He did not cause trouble. He did not get into fights with other inmates. He followed the rules. He participated in counseling and educational programs that were made available to him. He read extensively. He spent time in contemplation, or at least appeared to based on his behavior and demeanor. However, David McGregor also never expressed genuine remorse for his actions. He never wrote a confession or an admission of guilt. When he was allowed to speak to representatives of various organizations, journalists, authors, documentary filmmakers, he continued to maintain that he had been a loving father who had simply been trying to prepare his son for a difficult world, and that while he regretted that Chase had died, he did not believe that his training methods were inappropriate or abusive. This lack of remorse, combined with the nature of his crime and the evidence that had been presented at trial, meant that none of the various appeals or petitions for clemency that were filed on David's behalf were granted. His death sentence remained in place. In 2025, approximately 16 years after Chase's death and his own conviction, David McGregor was executed. The execution took place at the Huntsville unit of the Texas Department of Criminal Justice, the location where all executions in Texas are carried out. David was given the standard option of a last meal, the tradition in Texas, though this tradition is slowly being phased out in many states. He requested a steak dinner, mashed potatoes, and apple pie, which he was served. Before his execution, David was allowed to make a final statement. He was led into the execution chamber, a small room with a gurney, restraints, and various medical equipment. Present in the room were several official witnesses, representatives of the state, representatives of various law enforcement agencies, and a chaplain from the correctional facility. David McGregor's final statement was brief. He said that he loved his son, that he had been trying to help his son become strong, that he was sorry that his methods had not worked as he had intended. He did not apologize for what he had done. He did not express remorse for Chase's death. He simply stated his regret that his efforts to toughen Chase had resulted in Chase's death. As the lethal injection was administered, the standard Texas execution protocol involves 3 drugs administered in sequence: an anesthetic, pancuronium bromide, which paralyzes the muscles, and potassium chloride, which stops the heart. David McGregor's final words were, according to prison officials present, "I was trying to make him strong." He was pronounced dead at 6:32 p.m. on the date of his execution. The case of David McGregor was closed. In the years following David McGregor's execution, the case continued to be discussed and analyzed. It was featured in several documentary series about capital punishment in the United States. It was discussed in academic papers about child abuse and parental rights. It was cited in various legal cases dealing with similar issues. But perhaps most importantly, Chase McGregor's case became a reference point for understanding the importance of community intervention in cases of suspected child abuse. Teachers, neighbors, social workers, and others who work with children were trained to recognize the warning signs that Chase had displayed: physical injury, fatigue, unusual behavioral changes, fear and anxiety, social withdrawal, and difficulty forming normal friendships and relationships. Chase's case was used to illustrate the concept of grooming, not in the sexual sense, but in the sense of a process by which a child becomes accustomed to abuse and begins to internalize the belief that the abuse is normal, deserved, or even beneficial. Chase had been groomed by his father to believe that the intense physical training was something that he needed, something that would benefit him, something that he should be grateful for even though he suffered under it. The case was also used to illustrate the power of isolation as a tool of abuse. By removing Chase from normal social interactions, by preventing him from pursuing activities that he enjoyed, by subjecting him to extreme physical demands that left him exhausted and unable to participate in normal childhood activities, David McGregor had isolated Chase, had cut him off from potential sources of support or intervention. The question that continued to resonate in the aftermath of the case was, what if someone had intervened? What if a neighbor had called Child Protective Services? What if a teacher had reported their concerns to school administration? What if Mason's comment to Sarah Henderson at the summer cookout had been taken more seriously by David McGregor had been confronted by law enforcement before Chase died? What if? The reality was that these intervention points had existed, and they had not been taken advantage of. Neighbors had been uncomfortable but had not reported. Teachers had been concerned but had not escalated their concerns. Friends had noticed that something was wrong but had not known how to report it. In the aftermath of Chase's death, systems were put in place to try to prevent similar tragedies. School districts implemented mandatory reporting training for teachers and staff. Community organizations worked to educate the public about signs of abuse. Law enforcement training was revised to include a greater emphasis on responding to suspicions of child abuse. But all of these preventative measures could not undo what had already been done. Chase McGregor was still dead. David McGregor was still dead. The tragedy had still occurred. What remained, in the aftermath of all of this, was the memory of a gentle, artistic, kind-hearted 12-year-old boy. The memory of a child whose only crime was being different from his father, being soft where his father was hard, being artistic where his father was physical, being sensitive where his father was stoic. Chase's art continued to be displayed in galleries and community centers. His sketches and paintings were preserved, protected, and shared with new generations of people who would never meet him but who could appreciate his talent and his vision. In a way, Chase continued to speak from beyond his death, through his art, through his legacy, through the foundation established in his name. And his father, David McGregor, is also remembered, but in a very different way. He is remembered as a cautionary tale, as an example of what happens when a parent's need to control and to mold overshadows their ability to love and to accept. He is remembered as a man who confused toughness with love, who believed that breaking his son's spirit would somehow make his son stronger, and who ultimately paid the ultimate price for that confusion. At the end of the day, the case of David McGregor and Chase McGregor raises profound questions about the nature of parenting, the nature of toughness, the nature of love, and the responsibility that communities have to protect their most vulnerable members. It raises the question, what does it mean to be tough? Does it mean never showing vulnerability, never admitting weakness, never asking for help? Or does it mean being strong enough to acknowledge your vulnerabilities, strong enough to ask for help when you need it, strong enough to be authentic rather than performing a version of toughness that is really just fragility dressed up in aggression? It raises the question, what is the parent's role? Is a parent supposed to mold a child into a particular vision of who that child should be? Or is a parent supposed to help a child become the best version of themselves, whatever that version might be? And it raises the question, what is a community's responsibility when they suspect that a child is being abused? Is it enough to notice the signs and say nothing? Is it enough to feel uncomfortable and do nothing? Or do community members have a responsibility to act, to report, to intervene, even if it means disrupting their own sense of comfort or boundaries? These are not easy questions to answer. But they are questions that we must answer because the stakes are high. The stakes are a child's life. In the final analysis, the case of David McGregor and Chase McGregor is not ultimately about the criminal justice system or about capital punishment or about the legal system's response to abuse. It is ultimately about a child who wanted nothing more than his father's love and approval, and a father who was so blinded by his own ideology about what a child should be that he couldn't see the child he actually had. It is about a community that saw signs of trouble but wasn't sure whether to intervene. And it is about the tragic consequences that result when the people who are supposed to protect a child are either the ones harming the child or are unwilling to take action when they suspect harm. Chase McGregor's life mattered. His death matters. And his legacy, the foundation established in his name, the art that he created, the example he provides of the consequences of rigidity and the importance of acceptance, continues to matter. His story continues to speak to us, to challenge us, to ask us to think more carefully about how we parent, how we teach, how we support young people, and how we protect them from harm. The question that resonates most powerfully from this case, the question that should stay with every person who hears Chase's story, is the question that the judge posed directly to David McGregor in the courtroom. How do we become people who can look at our own children and see them as they are, rather than as we wish they would be? How do we learn to love them, not despite their differences from us, but sometimes precisely because of those differences? And how do we understand that the deepest strength often lies not in toughness and aggressiveness, but in the ability to be vulnerable, to be authentic, to be true to oneself even when the world demands conformity? Chase McGregor was a boy who was true to himself. He was artistic when his father wanted him to be athletic. He was sensitive when his father wanted him to be tough. He was creative when his father wanted him to be conventional. And his father, unable to accept these truths about his son, set about trying to erase them. And in the process of trying to make his son into something he was not, he destroyed his son entirely. That is the real tragedy of this case. Not just that a child died, but that a child died because his father couldn't accept him as he was. Please, if you're watching this, if you have children or grandchildren or nieces or nephews or young people in your life who you care about, please take a moment to think about whether you are accepting them as they are or whether you are trying to mold them into your image of what you think they should be. Please think about whether you are pushing them toward activities that they want to pursue or whether you are forcing them toward activities that you think they should pursue. Please think about whether you are listening to them when they tell you they are struggling, or whether you are dismissing their struggles as weakness. Because Chase McGregor's story should teach us that being a parent, being an adult responsible for a child's well-being, is not about creating a version of yourself. It's about helping that child become the best version of themselves, whatever that version might be. It's about accepting them, loving them, protecting them, even and especially when they are different from what you expected or wanted. If this story has affected you, if it has made you think about your own life, your own relationships, the children in your life, please comment below. Tell me, what did this story mean to you? What are your thoughts about David McGregor's crime? What are your thoughts about the death sentence? What have you learned from Chase's story? And if you haven't already, please subscribe to this channel. We explore cases like this one, Cases that challenge us to think more deeply about human nature, about justice, about responsibility and love and cruelty and all of the complex forces that shape our lives and our choices. Chase McGregor deserves to be remembered. David McGregor's crime deserves to be understood. And both of their stories deserve to live on, to continue teaching us, to continue challenging us to be better parents, better community members, better humans. Thank you for watching. Thank you for listening to Chase's story. Thank you for caring about what happened to him. And please, above all else, please take care of the young people in your life. Protect them. Accept them. Love them as they are. Because that is the most powerful lesson that Chase McGregor's tragedy can teach us.